What if the most dangerous moment of a medieval craftsman's day was not the night, but the morning? This story follows a single, ordinary day in 14th century Florence, seen through the quiet routines of a craftsman whose life depends on steady hands, guild rules, and the slow rhythm of the city. Over the course of one day, from before sunrise to deep night, the story will move through streets, workshops, markets, churches, and private thoughts, revealing how work, faith, fear, and habit shaped everyday life. There will be no great heroes and no spoken words, only the steady passing of hours in a city that believed order itself was a form of survival. Before the bells of Florence announced the day, the city already breathed. In the narrow streets between tall stone houses, the air held the cold of night and the faint smell of damp wool, ash, and old water. Windows remained dark, but movement existed behind walls, the quiet turning of bodies, the slow rising of men whose days were measured not by clocks but by light. Among them was the craftsman, already awake before the sun considered the horizon. He lay still for a moment on his wooden bed, listening. Somewhere far off, water ran through a channel. A mule shifted its weight in a nearby courtyard. The city was never silent, only restrained. He rose carefully, the floor cold under his feet, and pulled on garments that smelled faintly of yesterday's work. Each movement followed habit, learned over years, shaped by repetition more than thought. The room was small, shared with tools, cloth, and a narrow chest. Everything had its place, because disorder invited loss. In Florence, loss was not only personal, it could mean fines, shame, or exclusion from the guild. The craftsman washed his hands in a bowl of water left overnight, the chill sharpening his awareness. His hands were his livelihood. He examined them briefly in the low light, noting small cracks along the skin, marks of labor that never fully healed. Outside, the sky remained dark blue, but a subtle change had begun. The day was approaching whether the city was ready or not. He stepped into the street, closing the door softly behind him, as others did the same. Shadows moved where faces were barely visible. These early hours belonged to workers, bakers, dyers, porters, men who understood that time lost at dawn could never be recovered. As he walked, the stones beneath his feet were uneven, polished smooth by centuries of passing bodies. The smell of bread began to mix with the odor of waste carried from yesterday's rain. Florence revealed itself slowly, layer by layer, as if the city preferred not to be fully seen all at once. The craftsman crossed a small square where a shrine stood against a wall. A candle burned there, left by someone earlier, its flame unsteady in the morning air. He paused briefly, not in dramatic devotion but in acknowledgement. The day ahead would demand precision and patience. Fortune favored those who respected routine. By the time the first bell rang, he was already near his workshop. The sound spread through the streets, touching walls, roofs, and sleeping rooms alike. It marked the beginning not only of work, but of obligation. Doors opened. Shutters lifted. Florence, heavy with stone and memory, accepted another day. Inside the workshop, the tools waited in silence. Soon, the light would reach them, and the day would truly begin. Light entered Florence cautiously. It slid down the edges of rooftops and found its way into the streets, thin and pale, revealing details the night had hidden. Dust clung to stone. Scratches marked doors where carts had passed too closely. The craftsman unlocked the workshop and stepped inside, allowing the city to remain outside for a moment longer. The room smelled of wood, oil, and worked material, a familiar blend that signaled purpose. The tools rested exactly where they had been left the evening before. Nothing here was accidental. In a city governed by guilds, order was protection. Each object had been placed to satisfy not only habit but rules written and unwritten, enforced by masters, inspectors, and reputation. He opened the shutters gradually. Light fell across the workbench, illuminating the surface worn smooth by decades of use. Marks from earlier generations remained faintly visible beneath newer scratches. The bench itself was older than him, perhaps older than his father, and carried a quiet authority. It demanded care in return for service. The craftsman prepared the space methodically. He swept the floor, removing yesterday's remnants. Dust and fragments were collected and set aside, never wasted. Even refuse held value in Florence. Nothing was truly discarded if it could still serve another purpose. Outside, the street had grown louder. Footsteps echoed, carts rattled, and distant bells signaled hours to those who listened closely. The city was aligning itself into motion. Each guild member knew when to appear, when to begin, when to pause. To ignore this rhythm was to risk standing apart from it. He began the first task of the day while the air was still cool. Early hours favored steady hands. As the sun climbed higher, heat and distraction would follow. His movements were careful, deliberate, practiced through years of repetition. Each action depended on the one before it, a chain that could not be hurried without consequence. The workshop doorway remained open, a silent invitation and a silent warning. Passers-by could see the work, judge it, remember it. In Florence, visibility mattered. Reputation traveled faster than messengers, carried by glances and quiet comparisons. The craftsman remained focused, aware of time without measuring it. The bells would announce the hours whether he listened or not. His body understood the sequence: work first, pause later, endurance always. Hunger would come, but it would wait. Light now filled the room fully, touching the walls and revealing the true color of things. The city outside had awakened completely. Florence was no longer emerging, it was alive, demanding attention, labor, and obedience to its invisible structure. The day had begun in earnest, and there would be no escape from it until night returned. As the morning settled into its full shape, the street outside the workshop became a moving surface of bodies, goods, and intent. The craftsman worked with the door open, not from generosity, but from necessity. Air and light were as essential as tools, and the city provided both in constant motion. From his place at the bench, he noticed the changes without lifting his focus. Shadows shortened. The tone of footsteps shifted from hurried to measured. Those who passed early carried urgency, those who followed carried routine. Florence expressed itself through these small variations, invisible to those who did not depend on them. Across the street, another workshop opened. Wood scraped against stone as shutters were lifted. A familiar smell joined the air, signaling a trade related yet separate, bound by shared rules but guarded by competition. No words were exchanged. Recognition existed without acknowledgement. In this part of the city, silence was efficient. The craftsman paused briefly to adjust his hands, easing stiffness before it deepened. The morning was the safest part of the day. Minds were clear. Light was honest. Mistakes made now were fewer and easier to correct. He resumed work, aware that each finished piece would be examined not only by buyers, but by the unseen standard of the guild. Outside, vendors began to claim their spaces. Cloth was unrolled. Baskets were placed with care. The street widened in function if not in form. Florence adapted itself daily, reshaping the same narrow paths into routes of exchange and judgment. Occasionally, a glance from a passerby lingered on the work in progress. These glances mattered. Approval was silent. Disapproval even more so. A single careless detail could travel through the neighborhood by evening, carried by memory rather than speech. The craftsman remained steady, letting the city move around him. He did not chase attention. His role was not to impress, but to endure. Endurance was the measure of success in Florence, more reliable than ambition. As the sun climbed higher, warmth began to settle into the stone walls. The air thickened slightly. The first true signs of fatigue approached, still distant but inevitable. Morning was yielding its advantage, and the day was preparing to test him more directly. The city did not announce this shift. It simply continued. The light changed without warning. It no longer fell gently but pressed down, flattening shadows and warming the stone beneath it. Inside the workshop, the air grew heavier, carrying the layered sense of labor and street life. The craftsman adjusted his stance, aware that posture mattered more as hours passed. Fatigue entered the body quietly, beginning in the back and shoulders before spreading to the hands. Outside, the street slowed slightly. Movement continued, but with less urgency. The morning's sharp purpose softened into a steady procession. Carts passed less frequently. Vendors settled into their places, guarding their goods from sun and dust. Florence had reached a moment of balance between effort and restraint. The craftsman paused to clean his tools. This was not rest, but maintenance, an essential interruption. A tool neglected even briefly could betray its user later. He wiped each surface carefully, restoring order before returning to the bench. In this city, carelessness was remembered longer than excellence. A faint breeze passed through the open doorway, carrying voices from a distance without delivering meaning. Sound traveled differently at this hour, spreading wide but shallow, like water over stone. The craftsman remained untouched by it, his attention narrowed to the immediate world of hands and material. He worked through the growing warmth, aware that mistakes were more likely now. The guild's rules did not soften with the day. Standards remained fixed, indifferent to heat or exhaustion. He slowed his movement slightly, choosing precision over speed. Time lost could be regained. Reputation could not. The street reflected this same caution. People lingered longer in shaded places. Steps grew measured. Florence did not collapse under the sun, it adapted, bending its routines without breaking them. By the time the bells announced the next hour, the craftsman felt the first true hunger of the day. It was expected, almost welcomed, a reminder that the body still functioned as it should. Soon there would be a pause, brief but necessary, before work resumed. Midday approached, carrying with it both relief and risk. The day was far from finished, and the most demanding hours still waited ahead. The bells marked midday with a weight that felt heavier than the earlier hours. Their sound rolled through Florence, pressing against walls and roofs, entering workshops and homes alike. It did not command rest, but it allowed it. The craftsman set his tools down carefully, aligning them as if they would be judged in his absence. This pause was earned, not casual. He stepped outside, closing the workshop partway, leaving enough light to return without disruption. The street had changed character. Heat softened edges and dulled urgency. People moved less, stood more, sought shadows where they could find them. Stone radiated warmth collected since morning. The craftsman found a familiar place to sit, where the wall offered both shade and support. He ate simply, without ceremony. Food at this hour was functional, meant to restore rather than delight. He drank slowly, aware of how quickly strength could drain in the afternoon. Around him, Florence breathed more deeply. Even animals seemed subdued. The city did not sleep, but it rested its eyes. This brief suspension of effort held the day together, preventing it from tearing itself apart under its own weight. He observed without engagement. Faces passed, some known, some anonymous, all carrying their own measurements of time and labor. No one lingered too long. The pause had boundaries, enforced by habit rather than authority. As the bells faded, the craftsman rose. There was no reluctance. Rest was complete because it was limited. He returned to the workshop, reopening it fully, letting light and noise re-enter the space. The afternoon waited, less forgiving than the morning, but unavoidable. Work resumed as it must, with steady hands and quiet resolve. The afternoon settled over Florence like a held breath. Heat lingered in the stone, and the air inside the workshop felt slower, thicker, resisting movement. The craftsman returned to his bench with renewed energy that he knew would not last. Afternoon strength was a fragile thing, easily spent if not guarded. Light entered at a sharper angle now, revealing imperfections with cruel clarity. The surface of the work reflected this honesty, allowing nothing to hide. The craftsman adjusted his pace, aware that fatigue invited small errors, and small errors carried consequences beyond the moment. Outside, the street resumed its steady rhythm. Carts passed again, their wheels leaving faint echoes behind them. Voices rose and fell without settling into clarity. Florence spoke continuously, but rarely directly. The craftsman wiped his brow and continued. His hands moved from habit now more than intention, guided by memory stored in muscle and bone. Years of repetition protected him from collapse, but not from awareness. He felt the strain accumulate quietly, like dust settling on a surface that would not be cleaned until night. Occasionally, he paused to stretch his fingers, pressing them flat against the bench before resuming. These small acts of care extended the day, buying minutes and hours through restraint. In Florence, endurance was achieved not through force, but through management. Shadows began to lengthen outside the doorway. The light lost some of its sharpness, trading clarity for warmth. The city responded accordingly. Movements became less rigid. The day slowly loosened its grip. Still, work continued. The craftsman remained focused, knowing that the afternoon determined the quality of the day more than the morning ever could. What survived these hours could be trusted. The sun leaned westward, and Florence prepared, quietly and without announcement, for the long descent toward evening. The shift from afternoon to evening did not arrive as a clear moment, but as a gradual release. Light softened as it moved lower, sliding across the street rather than pressing down upon it. Inside the workshop, the harsh edges of the day eased. The craftsman noticed this change immediately. His eyes relaxed. His breathing slowed. The city was granting a small mercy. He adjusted his position to follow the light, turning his work slightly so that it remained visible without strain. This adaptation was instinctive, learned through years of observing how Florence behaved as the sun declined. The city was a teacher, offering lessons daily to those who paid attention. Outside, the street began to rearrange itself. Vendors started to gather their goods, folding cloth and stacking baskets. The urgency of trade faded, replaced by the quiet accounting of the day's outcomes. Success and failure were measured silently, carried home rather than displayed. The craftsman completed a section of work and set it aside carefully. Finishing something, even partially, mattered. It provided a sense of closure within a day that otherwise flowed without clear divisions. He cleaned his hands again, slower this time, letting water cool the warmth built up beneath the skin. Children's movement appeared briefly at the edges of the street, unstructured and light, soon pulled back indoors. The city tolerated this brief disorder before restoring itself to its preferred shape. As shadows stretched longer, Florence revealed a different face. The stone seemed less severe, colors deepened, and the air cooled enough to invite deeper breath. The craftsman felt the day's weight begin to lift slightly from his shoulders. Evening was approaching. Work would not end yet, but its nature was changing. The most demanding hours were passing, and what remained required patience rather than strength. Evening arrived quietly, without fanfare, carrying a cooler air that moved through the streets and into the workshop. The city's heat dissipated gradually, leaving behind the scent of stone warmed by the day, mingled with traces of wood, oil, and human labor. The craftsman paused for a moment, letting the change reach his skin, feeling the subtle relief it offered. Light from the west colored the room in amber hues, casting long, slow shadows across the bench and walls. Dust motes drifted lazily, catching the sun's last angle before dusk. In Florence, this hour revealed details invisible before: tiny cracks in stone, faint scratches on wood, and the subtle imperfections in tools that had been ignored in brighter hours. The craftsman noticed them all, acknowledging the truth of things as they were, unaltered by wish or desire. The street outside shifted as well. Vendors were nearly done, packing goods and securing wares. Footsteps were softer. Conversations were fewer, quieter. Florence, after the day's rigorous pulse, had slowed, as if exhaling. The craftsman remained at his bench, hands still moving, guided by muscle memory and the necessity to finish the work begun earlier. He wiped his hands, checking his materials with meticulous care. Even in the waning light, every task required precision. Errors made now could be corrected tomorrow, but pride and guild expectations demanded diligence until the final moment. In Florence, reputation was maintained through consistency, not speed. A faint breeze brought sounds of distant bells and the occasional clatter of hooves on cobblestones. The rhythm of the city now seemed less demanding, more contemplative. The craftsman felt a subtle shift within himself, a mix of fatigue and satisfaction. Hours of effort had passed into tangible form. Objects on the bench, shaped by skill and patience, reflected both labor and order. The air grew cooler still. Evening invited thought, reflection, and quiet endurance. The day was not yet finished, but its most consuming moments had passed. The craftsman continued, moving carefully, aware that the night would soon demand attention of a different kind. Twilight arrived as a slow sigh, stretching the day's labor into memory. The sun had already dipped below the western rooftops, leaving only a soft glow that lingered against Florence's stone. The city no longer pressed against the senses as it had during morning and afternoon. The clatter of carts, the sharp cries of vendors, and the hurried footsteps of passers-by had all diminished, replaced by the subtle, persistent hum of a place winding down after relentless effort. Within the workshop, the craftsman felt this change acutely. Shadows stretched along the walls, elongating tools and benches into shapes that seemed larger, heavier, almost sentient in the fading light. He moved with care, each gesture deliberate, ensuring that the rhythm of his hands did not betray his growing fatigue. The air had cooled, carrying the faint sense of evening, burnt wood from distant hearths, a whiff of river water from the Arno, the underlying scent of tallow lamps that had been lit in homes near the piazza. These layers of aroma clung to the stone and lingered on the craftsman's skin as he continued his work, reminding him that the day had been long and yet productive. His bench was now a tableau of the day's efforts. Pieces finished, half-finished, and freshly started lay arranged with exacting care, each occupying its designated space. The craftsman surveyed them briefly, his eyes tracing lines, curves, and edges that would bear judgment from the guild and the city in the days to come. Perfection was not an expectation but a discipline, a requirement embedded into every motion. Even now, as fatigue tugged at his back and shoulders, he maintained the same careful precision, adjusting tools, measuring twice, and correcting slight imperfections without the pressure of urgency but with the certainty that Florence demanded excellence. Outside, the street reflected the city's transition from activity to calm. Torches and lanterns began to appear in windows and along the narrow alleyways, casting flickering light against worn stone. Their movement suggested life without demanding it. The sounds of the day had not completely disappeared, instead, they transformed into a softer, subtler accompaniment, the distant clink of a metalworker's hammer, the shuffle of late pedestrians, and the occasional neigh of a mule returning to stables after a long day's work. This rhythm was different, measured not by labor but by survival. The craftsman continued, now acutely aware of the changing light. His hands worked almost autonomously, trained by years of repetition, yet he monitored each movement. Evening exposed imperfections that sunlight had hidden, and he adjusted for them meticulously. Each motion required care because errors in the final hours would echo into tomorrow, affecting reputation and livelihood. Guilds maintained their standards strictly, but the city itself acted as a living, observing entity, weighing effort and diligence without voice or ceremony. The streets outside allowed glimpses of neighbors finishing their own work, doors closing, shutters lowered, and a rare, solitary figure moving through the alleys with deliberate care. Life was still present, but it had softened into a shadowed cadence, one that required respect for movement and timing. Within the workshop, the craftsman's attention remained absolute. He prepared a new section of work, smoothing rough surfaces, cleaning edges, and arranging tools within reach. Each item was considered, every movement accounted for. Light continued to fade, but he adjusted by shifting position, letting amber beams from outside illuminate his immediate workspace. The warmth of the day had left, replaced by the crispness of night approaching. Florence in twilight was different, more forgiving visually, yet subtly unforgiving in expectation. Even a single misplaced stroke or overlooked detail would remain, a reminder of human limitation in the presence of enduring stone, law, and labor. At times, he paused to observe the city from the doorway. Lanterns shimmered against walls, and the first hints of night's quiet dominance spread across rooftops and narrow streets. Shadows deepened, merging with the remaining traces of sunlight to form pools where detail became suggestion. These pools of light and dark were a reminder of Florence's dual nature, alive with industry and yet patient, waiting for the city's inhabitants to recognize their place within its unspoken hierarchy. For the craftsman, this was both observation and instruction. It was a moment of reflection, where the day's achievements and losses could be weighed silently without ceremony. As twilight progressed into deeper dusk, the workshop grew quieter. The air felt cooler, almost moist, carrying distant smells from gardens and riverbanks beyond the immediate city walls. The craftsman worked until lantern light could be brought inside, illuminating the bench and tools with a steady, controlled glow. Shadows danced across surfaces, exaggerating angles and flaws, demanding scrutiny and care. The final hours of the day were the truest test of discipline, and he met it with the calm precision that had carried him through centuries of practice, through mornings of labor, afternoons of endurance, and the soft decline of twilight. Florence had changed around him, slowed, softened, and cooled, yet remained unyielding in expectation. The craftsman's hands moved with deliberate intent, bringing the day's work to a conclusion that, while incomplete, reflected order, discipline, and survival. Outside, the city settled into its nocturnal rhythm, quieting, but never silent, carrying the memory of the day into night. Inside, the workshop glowed softly, a beacon of human diligence and persistence, marking the craftsman's place within the timeless pulse of Florence. Night descended gradually, as though Florence had drawn a slow, deliberate curtain across its rooftops and piazzas. The last traces of amber light disappeared, leaving only the faint glow of lanterns swinging from walls and windows. The city exhaled, trading the weight of labor for the hush of darkness, though it did not sleep. Even in the quiet, Florence maintained its invisible structure. Shadows held paths, alleyways guided movement, and the faint sound of distant voices reminded inhabitants that the day's efforts had consequences beyond their own walls. Inside the workshop, the craftsman adjusted a lantern near the bench, casting steady illumination over tools, half-finished work, and the accumulated remnants of the day. The glow created pockets of clarity and pools of shadow, forcing careful attention to detail. By now, fatigue had settled in his shoulders and fingers, a weight that demanded controlled movement and deliberate pauses. Each motion was slower but no less precise. The day was nearly over, yet the work had not yet been fully contained. To falter now could undo hours of careful effort. The city outside had changed subtly with nightfall. Streets that had carried the clamor of carts, the hum of vendors, and the shuffle of countless feet were now punctuated by quieter steps. Muffled conversations drifted from windows, church bells tolled occasionally in the distance, and the air carried the faint, persistent aroma of evening fires and cooling stone. Even the river's movement seemed gentler, reflecting lamplight that quivered across the water's surface. Florence at night demanded a different rhythm, one of observation and restraint rather than speed or force. The craftsman had learned to adapt to it, moving with the city's new tempo rather than resisting it. Within the workshop, his hands continued their work, guided by experience and memory. Tools were checked and adjusted, edges smoothed, surfaces polished. Despite exhaustion, every piece received attention that bordered on devotion, for the guild standards were silent but strict, and the city's invisible judgment was equally exacting. The craftsman's movements were measured, conserving energy while maintaining accuracy, a delicate balance that defined both skill and endurance. Occasionally, he paused to observe the street through the open doorway. Lantern light cast elongated shadows on cobblestones, and silhouettes of figures moved with careful deliberation. A delivery cart creaked along a side street, its wheels slow, careful, each movement measured. A stray cat padded silently across the stones, its presence a reminder that life continued independently of human effort. Florence's nighttime rhythm was subtle but unyielding, and those who moved within it had to respect its rules or risk error, injury, or misfortune. The craftsman's senses were sharpened by both fatigue and the soft darkness. He noted subtle changes in the light, the texture of the materials beneath his fingers, the faint drafts that hinted at open windows or street openings. Each observation informed his next action. Even as the city became quieter, attention could not waver. The night demanded vigilance as much as the day had demanded endurance. Lanterns flickered as the wind shifted, throwing brief shadows across benches and tools. The craftsman adjusted one, ensuring that it would not tip, that the light would remain stable, that the last hours of work would not be compromised by inattention. Night carried no mercy for mistakes, only the chance to correct them before the next day's scrutiny. As darkness deepened, Florence revealed both its beauty and its restraint. Stone walls glowed softly in lamplight, rooftops receded into shadow, and the distant church tower stood silent but perceptible against the star-dotted sky. The craftsman moved steadily, aware that this final stretch of labor, while slower, defined the day's true measure. Endurance was tested not in moments of vigor but in those of waning energy, when the mind and body could betray the hours of experience stored within them. By the late evening, the workshop had transformed into a quiet sanctuary. Work remained on the bench, neat, organized, and partially complete. The city outside continued its muted activity, but the pressure of day had lifted. The craftsman's hands moved with practiced deliberation, attending to details that would endure, knowing that Florence's silent judgment would persist even after he left. Night had arrived fully, bringing both reprieve and demand. The craftsman paused briefly, stretching tired limbs, allowing the cool air to soothe the heat accumulated from labor. Every piece of wood, metal, and cloth bore the imprint of discipline and care. The city's heartbeat slowed, but its pulse remained. The craftsman's role, though solitary in these hours, was intertwined with this rhythm, each action a response to the demands of both material and metropolis. The workshop doors were closed lightly, casting shadows across the street. Florence slept partially but remained alive, its structures, streets, and silent observers still present. The craftsman's work would continue tomorrow, but tonight was the first breath after relentless motion, a quiet acknowledgement that survival, order, and craft were intertwined in ways that demanded constant attention. The city at night was different, yet no less exacting. Lanterns flickered along narrow streets, their glow reflecting off cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of passage. Florence had shifted into a state of stillness, yet life persisted in subtle patterns. A distant dog barked, a carriage rumbled somewhere beyond the walls, and the faint murmur of voices floated from open windows. The craftsman moved carefully in this softened world, aware that even in the absence of the sun, errors could betray him. Night demanded attention as much as day, though in a quieter, almost imperceptible form. Within the workshop, light from a small lantern cast long shadows across benches and walls. Tools gleamed in the glow, and the work at hand appeared transformed in the subtle contrast between illumination and darkness. The craftsman's hands moved deliberately, smoothing surfaces, adjusting pieces, and checking edges. Fatigue tugged insistently at muscles and joints, yet he persisted. Experience guided him now more than conscious thought. His body knew the rhythm of the day and the careful motions required to maintain precision. Every movement was measured, conserving energy while sustaining the discipline the guild expected and Florence silently enforced. The street outside was quiet but not empty. A lone figure passed at intervals, careful to avoid lantern light and the sharp shadows that betrayed movement. Horses and carts, once insistent in their passage, had given way to stillness. Even the river's surface appeared calmer, its gentle lap against the bank carrying no urgency, only subtle motion that mirrored the city's nocturnal pulse. The craftsman noticed these shifts without needing to consider them. Florence was a living teacher, offering cues to those who watched closely. He paused briefly to rest his eyes and hands, leaning against the workbench. The silence was not emptiness but density, filled with the accumulated residue of a day's labor. The scents of wood, oil, and cooled stone were heavier now, mingling with the faint aroma of evening fires from neighboring houses. In this quiet, he could sense the lingering presence of the day, every mistake, every careful correction, every movement that had maintained order in the face of fatigue. The workshop had become a record of both diligence and endurance, a place where the city's invisible standards were honored without need for observation. Lantern light flickered as a breeze shifted through the doorway, bringing a brief chill that reminded him of the body's limits. He adjusted his position, moved materials out of the shadow, and resumed work. Each stroke, each measurement, each alignment carried significance. Night permitted no carelessness. A minor lapse could persist, silently undermining hours of effort. The craftsman's mind, sharpened by repetition and habit, anticipated potential errors before they occurred, his body executing corrections before thought was fully engaged. Occasionally, he looked out toward the darkened street, noting the rhythm of the city. Shadows elongated, and lamplight shimmered on the uneven stone. Florence remained present and exacting even when ostensibly still, and he moved with an understanding that the city judged silently. The workbench, illuminated by a solitary lantern, became the center of a controlled universe within the sprawling unpredictability of the metropolis. Here, order was created, maintained, and preserved. The craftsman's movements slowed only slightly as exhaustion deepened, but precision remained. The discipline required was more than skill, it was survival, a form of endurance learned over years and reinforced by the city's constant, quiet scrutiny. Each completed task was carefully placed aside, forming a tableau of labor that would stand as evidence of diligence. Florence did not need to speak, its streets, walls, and neighbors remembered, observed, and measured. By now, the sky had darkened fully. Stars dotted the heavens, distant and indifferent, yet somehow companionable in their constancy. Inside the workshop, the lantern light glimmered against worn surfaces, revealing both flaws and triumphs. The craftsman continued his labor until every detail he could manage was tended, leaving only the minor imperfections that would be addressed on the morrow. Night's duty demanded respect, and he had met it fully, even as the city outside rested in its partial, watchful quiet. The air had cooled further, bringing clarity and alertness despite fatigue. Shadows deepened around the room, yet within them, order prevailed. The craftsman moved with care, aware that the night would not excuse oversight, that Florence's silent standards persisted even when humans rested. Work was nearly complete, but the final hours required sustained attention, a quiet endurance as exacting as the day's labor had been. Night had settled fully over Florence, draping the city in a quiet, contemplative darkness. The streets were largely empty now, yet their presence was felt in every echo, every faint ripple of sound from distant windows or alleyways. Even in rest, the city maintained its invisible order, shadows guided movement, stone walls held centuries of memory, and the faint clatter of a distant cart reminded all who remained awake that labor and vigilance were never truly complete. Within his workshop, the craftsman recognized this duality, solitude and observation intertwined. He moved deliberately, aware that mistakes made in these hours would persist, unnoticed but tangible, like a whisper lodged in stone. The lantern light cast long, wavering shadows across the bench and tools. Each instrument gleamed faintly in the soft glow, and the half-finished work appeared transformed, revealing subtle imperfections that daylight had not exposed. The craftsman's hands worked steadily, guided by muscle memory and years of repetition. Fatigue tugged insistently at his shoulders and joints, yet he compensated with deliberate slowness, ensuring precision despite exhaustion. Every motion was a negotiation between the body's limits and the demands of the craft, a careful balance maintained in silence. Outside, Florence breathed quietly. A cat slipped through a narrow alley, moving with careful grace. A solitary figure emerged briefly from a window, closing shutters after an evening prayer. The river carried faint reflections of distant lanterns, shimmering and fractured, reminding all who watched that life persisted even in muted form. The craftsman observed without engagement, allowing these subtle rhythms to guide his own, attuning himself to the city's nocturnal cadence. Night demanded vigilance, not urgency, a quiet insistence that work be exact even when the hours were long and the streets silent. Within the workshop, he shifted materials with meticulous care. Pieces were arranged, measured, and remeasured. Tools were cleaned, edges checked, surfaces smoothed. The fatigue in his hands was met with conscious resistance, motion slowed, but attention sharpened. Evening had revealed flaws, and night demanded correction. Each stroke carried weight, not only in the material but in the unspoken standards of guild and city alike. Florence's judgment was silent, yet absolute. At times, he paused to stretch, pressing his fingers and shoulders against the bench to relieve strain. These small actions were vital, they allowed him to continue without error, to preserve both skill and endurance. Even the briefest lapse in concentration could undermine hours of labor. The night's rhythm required patience, awareness, and a steady hand. It rewarded neither haste nor neglect, only careful perseverance. The lantern's glow flickered in response to drafts from the open doorway. Shadows danced across the walls, revealing details both minor and significant. The craftsman adjusted the light, ensuring stability, and resumed work. Each piece he touched reflected his experience, his discipline, and his understanding of the city's invisible expectations. Florence, even in stillness, demanded this care. Hours passed. The city remained quiet but present. The faint scent of smoke from distant hearths mingled with the odor of aged wood and cooled stone inside the workshop. The craftsman's movements became rhythmic, almost meditative. His hands, eyes, and mind were engaged in a delicate dance of attention and endurance, refining and preserving the day's labor. Night in Florence was a test not of strength but of subtlety, a challenge that demanded patience, skill, and respect for the limits of body and material alike. Toward the later hours, the streets seemed to hold their breath. Lanterns glimmered dimly, casting long shadows that shifted imperceptibly as the wind stirred. The craftsman worked with deliberate care, aware that the final products of this day would endure longer than his own memory. Each object was a testament to the discipline required by the guild, by Florence itself, and by the relentless passage of time. The night was long, but it carried the quiet assurance that labor well done would be preserved, recognized in its subtle perfection, and ready to face the scrutiny of the coming day. As midnight approached, Florence transformed into a city of shadows and hushed movement. The warmth of the day had departed, leaving the stone cool beneath the feet of those still awake. Lanterns glimmered in windows and along narrow alleyways, casting trembling pools of light that shifted with the faintest breeze. Even in near-complete darkness, the city's structure remained intact. Every street, every doorway, every wall bore memory, expectation, and the silent witness of generations. The craftsman, immersed in his work, moved within this subdued landscape, aware that night offered no pardon for carelessness. Fatigue weighed upon his shoulders, spread through his arms, and pressed into his hands, yet his motions remained deliberate, precise, and careful. Inside the workshop, the lantern's glow provided a steady circle of light, illuminating the bench and the tools that had carried the day's labor. The craftsman's hands worked in measured repetition, smoothing surfaces, aligning edges, and adjusting details that had escaped attention in earlier hours. Each movement was deliberate, conserving energy while maintaining the accuracy demanded by both guild rules and the silent expectations of the city. Mistakes now could not be masked by sunlight or morning activity, they would linger as evidence, noticed by the body, the material, and the memory of the day itself. Outside, the city had become quieter still. Occasionally, the faint sound of a passing horse or a lone figure moving through the alley reminded the craftsman that Florence, though subdued, never truly rested. Even the river's flow seemed gentler, its lapping against the banks a soft accompaniment to the silence, reflecting lamplight like liquid gold. He observed these subtleties without leaving the bench, allowing the rhythm of the city's night to synchronize with his own actions. The subtle cues, the change in shadow, the slight shift in temperature, the distant echo of life, were as instructive as any guild mandate. The workbench had become a place of concentration and reflection, each item a record of discipline. Pieces were carefully arranged, measured, and remeasured, checked and adjusted. The craftsman's body insisted on pauses, small stretches of the shoulders, wrists, and fingers to stave off cramp, yet each pause was intentional, a deliberate integration of rest into labor. The night demanded patience and awareness, and every motion reflected both skill and endurance. The lantern flickered as a breeze swept through the workshop doorway, briefly casting exaggerated shadows across tools and unfinished work. The craftsman adjusted its position with a calm precision, ensuring the light remained stable. Darkness and shadow revealed flaws that daylight had overlooked, night required correction, a final refinement of the day's labor. Florence's quiet scrutiny was invisible yet exacting, and the craftsman responded in kind, moving with attention and care. Hours passed in a rhythm measured not by bells or voices, but by the slow passage of shadows across the walls and the faint, persistent hum of the sleeping city. Each correction, adjustment, and smoothing of material represented not only craft but the endurance of human vigilance, the ability to maintain precision even as the body demanded reprieve. The night was long, yet the craftsman remained engaged, guided by habit, observation, and the unspoken order of Florence itself. In these hours, the city and the craftsman existed in tandem, one testing the limits of endurance, the other responding with quiet diligence. The final tasks of the day were executed with careful deliberation. Each piece on the bench bore witness to his skill, discipline, and adherence to both guild expectation and the city's silent standards. Night had become an ally, revealing truths hidden by light, offering clarity in the shadows, and demanding careful attention. By the stroke of midnight, the workshop had achieved a balance between labor and observation, order and fatigue. The craftsman's hands moved with steady precision, completing adjustments that would preserve the integrity of his work. Outside, Florence remained present, a quiet, watchful city, its streets empty but alive with memory and expectation. Within this partnership of craft and city, the day's cycle drew closer to conclusion, leaving only the final hours to navigate before rest could be earned and the city's vigil temporarily relaxed. After midnight, Florence seemed suspended between the past and what would come with the new day. The city's stone streets cooled beneath the faint moonlight, lanterns casting soft, wavering shadows along walls and narrow alleyways. Silence had deepened, yet it was not emptiness. The faint rustle of animals, the occasional drip of water from a rooftop, and the gentle hum of the distant river reminded the craftsman that the city remained alive, observing, and exacting in its subtle way. The workshop, lit by a single lantern, was a small sanctuary where the day's labor and the night's reflection converged. Every surface, every tool, and every piece of work carried evidence of hours spent in deliberate motion, careful correction, and sustained attention. The craftsman paused for a moment, leaning slightly against the workbench, hands resting on smooth wood. He allowed his eyes to follow the faint outlines of the room, noting the shadows cast by tools and materials, the subtle imperfections that had been corrected and those that remained to be addressed. Fatigue tugged at every joint, yet a quiet satisfaction steadied him. The day had been long and demanding, but the work completed was a testament to discipline and endurance. Florence required this, attention to detail, patience, and precision, and he had met its demands without hesitation. Outside, the city's rhythm was slower but persistent. The occasional passerby, moving softly through an alley, left faint echoes on cobblestones. A cat traced silent paths between shadows, careful not to disturb the fragile stillness. Even the river's flow, gentle and unhurried, seemed to mirror the measured pace of the craftsman's movements. The city, though largely at rest, maintained its invisible order, reminding him that vigilance was never fully suspended. Each gesture, however small, had meaning. Every pause, correction, and careful action mattered in a place where reputation and survival intertwined. The craftsman returned to the workbench, arranging tools and materials with meticulous care. Surfaces were wiped, edges polished, and pieces aligned precisely as they would be presented to guild standards. The lantern's light flickered slightly, casting dancing shadows that revealed minor imperfections and required subtle adjustments. Even as exhaustion pressed upon him, he moved with controlled precision, relying on years of experience to guide each motion. Night demanded this diligence, errors left uncorrected would not be forgiven by the silent judgment of Florence. Minutes blended into hours, each one marked only by subtle changes in light and shadow. The craftsman's body ached in predictable ways, yet his mind remained alert. He noticed the faint chill of night air, the way lantern light glimmered on polished surfaces, and the gentle creak of wooden floors under his feet. These details informed every movement, ensuring that each adjustment was deliberate and measured. In this quiet, concentration and endurance merged into a single practice, the creation and preservation of order. The streets outside, while largely empty, still carried signs of life. Distant lanterns flickered behind shuttered windows. A dog barked briefly, a mule shifted somewhere in a courtyard, and faint voices echoed through alleyways as late-night travelers returned home. Florence was not still, merely quieter, observing the craftsman's efforts in subtle, persistent ways. He moved in harmony with this rhythm, aware that the city's silent standards required constant vigilance. Within the workshop, the day's labor had been carefully shaped, corrected, and preserved. The craftsman's hands, though weary, continued their methodical work, guided by discipline and habit. Every piece reflected attention, endurance, and fidelity to the expectations of the guild and the city itself. Night had revealed flaws hidden in daylight and demanded correction. He had met this challenge with calm diligence. The city, the workshop, and the craftsman existed in quiet accord, each shaping and reflecting the others in subtle ways. By the late hours, Florence had become a landscape of shadows and faint light, a city both alive and subdued. The craftsman moved carefully, ensuring that every detail, every tool, and every piece of work was in order before the final moments of the night approached. This was the culmination of the day's labor, the quiet mastery of endurance, observation, and skill. The work was nearly complete, yet required vigilance until the first hints of dawn. The night carried no urgency, only expectation, and he fulfilled it with steady, unbroken attention. The night deepened further, stretching Florence into a quiet expanse of shadow and faint lamplight. The streets were nearly empty, yet life persisted in subtle forms, a distant dog's bark, the occasional shuffle of a night traveler, and the faint lapping of the Arno against its banks. Even the breeze, moving softly through alleyways and open windows, carried reminders that the city remained awake in its own way. Inside the workshop, the craftsman felt the full weight of these silent hours. His body was weary, muscles stiff, but the discipline of the day compelled him to continue. Every motion, however small, mattered, and the night demanded attention equal to that of the harshest afternoon sun. The lantern's light cut through darkness, illuminating the worn surfaces of the workbench and the tools laid in precise order. The craftsman's hands moved with careful deliberation, smoothing edges, aligning materials, and checking the day's progress. Fatigue tugged at him persistently, yet his movements retained clarity and precision. Years of repeated practice allowed his body to guide his hands even as his mind lingered on the passage of hours. Each gesture was both a continuation of the day and a preparation for the next, a bridge between labor and endurance, between observation and creation. Outside, Florence whispered. Shadows deepened across the walls of narrow streets, blending alleys and courtyards into near invisibility. A stray cat moved silently over the stones, its passage measured and careful. The distant hum of water in the Arno mirrored the steady rhythm of the craftsman's hands. Even in stillness, the city demanded vigilance. Every misstep in attention could echo in ways subtle but lasting, a lesson the craftsman had learned through years of careful observation and measured action. He paused briefly, resting hands on the workbench, feeling the stiffness in his shoulders and wrists. The cool night air seeped in through the doorway, brushing against his skin and invigorating his senses just enough to continue. Each pause was calculated, a small act of maintenance to extend endurance rather than an indulgence. The workshop, bathed in lantern light, had become a world unto itself, a space of order, reflection, and quiet persistence. Here, the day's chaos could be tamed and reconciled with the discipline of the craftsman's hands. Minutes and hours blurred together as he continued. Tools were cleaned, surfaces polished, and materials arranged meticulously. The lantern flickered occasionally, shadows dancing across the bench and walls, revealing subtle imperfections that demanded correction. Night had a way of revealing what daylight had hidden, and each correction strengthened the integrity of the work. Florence's judgment, silent and patient, was ever present. The craftsman responded not with anxiety but with measured diligence, moving through the hours with steady, practiced precision. Outside, the faintest sounds of preparation for dawn began to emerge. The city's animals shifted in their rest, and distant voices hinted at those who rose before the sun to begin another day. Florence, though cloaked in darkness, remained vigilant. The craftsman adapted to this subtle energy, aligning his actions with the quiet pulse of the city. Each movement reinforced the day's discipline, the persistent rhythm of survival, and the expectation of continuity in craft and routine. By the final hours before dawn, the workshop had become both a haven and a testament, tools and materials organized, work refined, and surfaces smoothed. The craftsman's body ached, but his attention remained unbroken. Night demanded endurance, patience, and care, and he had met each demand fully. The quiet hours were both testing and confirming the day's labor, leaving a sense of measured accomplishment that would carry into the first moments of the new day. Florence rested partially, but it remained alive, watchful, and exacting, a city whose expectations extended beyond light and into the very rhythm of those who served it. The first hints of dawn arrived slowly, almost imperceptibly, brushing the edges of Florence with pale light. The horizon softened from deep indigo to muted gray, and a faint, cool glow began to touch the rooftops, cobblestones, and walls of the city. The night's shadows retreated gradually, dissolving into shapes that were familiar but newly defined in the early morning. The city was still quiet, but it stirred with anticipation, preparing to awaken again. Within the workshop, the craftsman noticed the change immediately. Light, subtle and unassuming, revealed details that lanterns had obscured, exposing textures and imperfections that demanded attention before the sun's full arrival. He adjusted the lantern, allowing the gentle illumination of dawn to enter the space, merging with the warm glow of the flame. His hands moved with deliberate care, continuing to refine and organize the day's work. Fatigue lingered, a persistent presence in his muscles and joints, yet the novelty of early light invigorated his senses. Every motion required both skill and awareness, for the first rays of sun could expose flaws invisible even under the flickering lantern. Florence, as always, observed silently, its standards unyielding even in the softest glow of morning. Outside, the streets were almost empty, save for a few early risers. A baker rolled dough in the faint light of a courtyard, a servant carried water in the narrow alleyways, and the occasional figure moved quietly toward the river, their footsteps muted on cold stone. The air was crisp, carrying both the lingering sense of night, smoke, damp earth, and cooling stone, and the promise of day, fresh bread, heated hearths, and the faint aroma of oil from distant workshops. The craftsman's attention remained on the bench, yet he absorbed these details, letting the city's early rhythms guide his work as much as his training and instinct. He paused briefly, stretching his shoulders and fingers, acknowledging the gradual shift from night's stillness to morning's activity. Every tool was inspected, every surface adjusted, and each piece of work set precisely in its place. Dawn's light demanded precision, revealing both the triumphs and imperfections of hours spent in darkness. The craftsman's eyes moved carefully across the bench, scanning lines, checking alignment, and correcting subtle flaws before they could harden into permanent marks. Florence required nothing less than constant vigilance, and he responded with the patience and discipline honed over years of experience. The city's awakening became more evident as time passed. Birds began to stir, their soft calls filling the alleys with a gentle chorus. Distant church bells told the early hour, their sound echoing across rooftops and courtyards, marking the inevitable progression of the day. Vendors and tradespeople would soon emerge, each moving according to the rhythms established by guilds and custom. The craftsman worked with quiet determination, aware that the city's life was returning, yet still alone in his controlled environment. The contrast between solitude and urban awakening sharpened his focus, emphasizing the importance of precision, care, and timing in the final adjustments of the night's labor. By the time the first golden shafts of sunlight broke fully across Florence, the workshop was organized, the workbench orderly, and the day's tasks preserved in a state of readiness. The craftsman paused, briefly surveying the room and the faintly illuminated streets beyond. The city's pulse had shifted, leaving the night behind but carrying the memory of its lessons, endurance, attention to detail, and quiet diligence. The first light of day brought renewal, but also subtle judgment, and the craftsman's work, refined and complete, stood ready to meet it. The air smelled faintly of stone warmed by the early sun, of the river, and of wood prepared for use. Florence exhaled gently, as though acknowledging the persistence of those who labored within its bounds. The craftsman returned to his workbench, making minor adjustments, ensuring each item was positioned perfectly. Dawn demanded vigilance as much as night, and he responded, steady, patient, and deliberate, poised for the day that was about to begin. With the rising sun, Florence shifted from the subtle stillness of dawn into the deliberate movement of early morning. Light now spilled fully across rooftops and streets, illuminating the city in warm, golden hues. The workshop, once a cocoon of night and lantern light, was now bathed in natural brightness. Shadows shortened, textures became clearer, and even the faintest flaws in tools or workpieces could no longer hide. The craftsman adjusted his stance and the position of materials, aligning surfaces with renewed care. The day demanded vigilance, not just from labor, but from awareness. The city's judgment, though silent, was immediate and exacting. Outside, Florence stirred with soft energy. Bakers pulled fresh bread from ovens, filling alleyways with rich, yeasty aromas. Servants hurried along cobblestones carrying water and firewood. A carriage creaked past, wheels rattling over uneven streets. The river reflected sunlight, glinting across ripples and casting sparkling patterns along stone bridges. The city's pulse quickened subtly, but it remained orderly, a rhythm learned through centuries of habit, guild enforcement, and unspoken social expectation. The craftsman's work continued in quiet parallel, his hands steady, matching the city's measured awakening with precision and care. The bench held the remnants of night labor, partially finished pieces, organized tools, and surfaces prepared for the day's scrutiny. Each item reflected both skill and endurance, evidence of hours spent in near solitude. He worked systematically, cleaning, smoothing, and adjusting, ensuring that every detail was accounted for before the first visitors or guild representatives arrived. Florence's early light revealed imperfections that the night had hidden, yet also illuminated the success of careful effort. Every surface, every curve, every joint was scrutinized under this clarity, the city itself a silent overseer of craft and discipline. Streets outside were now increasingly active. Merchants began to set up stalls, rolling out cloth, arranging baskets, and speaking quietly to assistants. The clatter of hooves and carts grew more frequent, blending with footsteps and the occasional shout of early laborers. Even in its early bustle, Florence maintained an invisible order, paths were predictable, voices measured, and commerce carefully contained within custom and routine. The craftsman absorbed this subtle choreography without interruption, his movements deliberate and disciplined, matching the city's tempo even within the confines of his workshop. Light continued to intensify, revealing more details of both the city and his work. Surfaces of wood, metal, and cloth caught sunbeams, reflecting imperfections and strengths alike. The craftsman's hands moved with a combination of instinct and experience, correcting minor flaws, reinforcing joints, and preparing the work to withstand both inspection and use. The sun's rise did not forgive error, it magnified it. Yet it also rewarded care, making precision visible and immediate. His vigilance mirrored that of the city itself, observant, patient, and exacting. The sounds of Florence's awakening filtered into the workshop, not distracting but enhancing awareness. Birds called from rooftops, carts rattled across cobblestones, and voices carried faintly from distant piazzas. Each sound signaled a shift in the day's rhythm, a reminder that labor must continue within the constraints of human endurance and social expectation. The craftsman, attuned to both the physical and temporal nuances of his environment, allowed these signals to guide minor adjustments in pace, posture, and attention. By mid-morning, the city's energy had fully manifested, yet the workshop maintained its own controlled rhythm. Tools were sharpened, materials aligned, and surfaces cleaned and polished. Each object reflected both the lessons of night's labor and the demands of day, balancing precision, endurance, and the expectation of scrutiny from guild and city alike. The craftsman's hands moved steadily, guided by practice, patience, and the unspoken pressures of Florence itself. As Florence embraced its mid-morning identity, the craftsman's workbench became both an extension of the city and a sanctuary of order. The day's first hours were decisive, errors revealed, corrections made, and preparations for the day's commerce completed. Each action reflected the silent standards of the city and the discipline embedded in every gilded trade. Even amidst increasing noise, activity, and sunlight, the workshop remained a locus of precision, reflection, and meticulous care, holding both the weight of yesterday and the promise of the hours to come. By mid-morning, Florence had fully awakened. The streets, now bathed in bright sunlight, thrummed with purposeful motion. Merchants called softly to assistance, rolling out goods, arranging baskets, and stacking fabrics along the edges of piazzas. The hum of conversation carried from market stalls, echoing faintly off the stone walls. Horses and carts moved deliberately along cobblestones, their wheels clattering in measured rhythm, while townspeople negotiated purchases or paused to observe the unfolding commerce. In this rising tide of activity, the city maintained an invisible order, an expectation of movement that was both efficient and deliberate, observed by every stone and every resident. Inside his workshop, the craftsman worked with a quiet focus that contrasted the bustle outside. The morning light, now fully illuminating the space, revealed every subtle imperfection in tools and materials. The day demanded that nothing be left unchecked. Flaws previously hidden in shadows of night or the softer glow of dawn were now fully visible. The craftsman moved methodically, smoothing surfaces, aligning materials, and double-checking measurements. His hands, though carrying the fatigue of the long hours before sunrise, executed each motion with precision honed over years. Experience allowed instinct to guide his movements, while vigilance ensured that every adjustment met the exacting standards of both guild and city. The workshop itself was a stage where order and skill were on display. Each piece of work reflected the continuity of labor, shaped by both night's endurance and the rigor of day. Tools were aligned with exacting care, surfaces polished to catch the morning light, and components set deliberately to prevent error. Even minor corrections made now carried significance, for in Florence, the evidence of attention, or the lack of it, persisted beyond immediate observation. The craftsman's attention was unwavering, a testament to his understanding of the silent expectations woven into the city's fabric. Outside, Florence moved with its characteristic rhythm. Artisans emerged from their own workshops, joining the flow of commerce, while servants and townspeople carried supplies to homes and businesses. The soft murmur of conversation blended with the rhythmic clatter of wheels and hooves, creating a complex, harmonious pattern of activity. The city's pulse was strong, yet controlled, a measure of human diligence shaped by centuries of habit, law, and unspoken social order. Within this context, the craftsman's focused movements complemented the broader rhythm, his workbench an oasis of precision amidst the surrounding energy. Light shifted slightly as the sun climbed higher, revealing textures and details previously unnoticed. Shadows deepened along walls and under benches, highlighting edges, scratches, and minor imperfections. The craftsman moved deliberately, adjusting alignment, refining curves, and smoothing surfaces. Each motion was calculated, conserving energy while maintaining accuracy. The day's pressure demanded not speed but measured endurance, an understanding that precision mattered more than haste. Florence's standards were unyielding, yet silent, guiding those who observed closely with subtle, persistent influence. The sounds of the city became more defined. Vendors' calls rose slightly, children's footsteps echoed briefly in alleyways, and the distant chime of a bell signaled another hour passing. The craftsman incorporated these cues into his work rhythm, maintaining focus while adjusting for interruptions and environmental changes. Each adjustment reflected both physical skill and an awareness of temporal patterns, ensuring that his labor remained consistent and precise. By mid-morning, the workshop had settled into a controlled cadence. Surfaces were smooth, edges aligned, and tools maintained with careful attention. The craftsman's hands, guided by habit and discipline, executed every task with precision, reflecting both the lessons of the night and the ongoing demands of the day. Florence, alive outside but silent in judgment, observed and reinforced this diligence, shaping the work and the worker alike. Every moment was a balance of endurance, awareness, and skill, bridging the solitude of the workshop with the structured rhythm of the waking city. Late morning in Florence carried a heightened intensity. The sun had risen further, illuminating every stone, wall, and rooftop with a sharp clarity that left no detail unseen. Streets hummed with controlled activity, merchants arranged goods in neat rows, carts rumbled along cobblestones, and the soft shuffle of shoes on worn stone echoed alongside bursts of conversation. Even the hum of distant workshops contributed to a layered rhythm, a constant reminder that the city's life was both organized and relentless. The craftsman, though inside the relative shelter of his workshop, was acutely aware of this urban pulse. Every sound, shadow, and scent contributed to his perception, guiding subtle adjustments in posture, movement, and attention. Inside, the workshop was bathed in natural light. The day's illumination revealed the results of the night's careful labor, highlighting both achievements and flaws. The craftsman's hands moved methodically, touching surfaces with an experienced eye, adjusting imperfections, smoothing edges, and aligning pieces with precise care. Each task required focus, even minor errors were visible now, and Florence demanded that nothing remain unchecked. Fatigue from the long night persisted, tugging at shoulders and hands, yet it was met with deliberate rhythm, allowing endurance to support both consistency and quality. The bench itself was a testament to diligence. Tools lay in exact alignment, materials arranged by type and stage of completion, and surfaces polished to reveal subtle contours. The craftsman moved between stations with practiced efficiency, each gesture reflecting habit reinforced by countless days of meticulous attention. He navigated the space with awareness of both his physical limits and the city's invisible expectations. Florence, though not vocal, assessed the quality of labor in every detail, and the craftsman responded instinctively to this silent scrutiny, ensuring that each piece met standards of both utility and artistry. Beyond the workshop, the city's activity intensified. Apprentices and assistants moved swiftly along streets, carrying supplies or completing errands. The clatter of metal and wood resonated faintly from nearby workshops. Conversations rose and fell in measured cadence, punctuated occasionally by laughter or the bell of a distant church. Even the animals of Florence contributed to the rhythm, the soft whinny of horses, the click of hooves, and the mew of a cat weaving among the shadows created an auditory tapestry that framed the craftsman's day. Within the workshop, these sounds informed movement, timing, and attention, shaping the pace of work and reinforcing the integration of human effort with urban life. Sunlight shifted subtly across surfaces, revealing textures, highlights, and shadows. The craftsman paused occasionally, adjusting light or repositioning materials to ensure every surface could be assessed fully. Each adjustment was intentional, conserving energy while maintaining precision. Corrections were made not in haste, but with deliberate care, a reflection of both skill and understanding of Florence's silent demands. The city required endurance, observation, and measured action, qualities that the craftsman had cultivated and now applied with patience and precision. By this point in the late morning, the workshop had become a controlled microcosm of Florence itself, orderly, meticulous, and alive with subtle activity. The craftsman's work reflected the continuity of effort from the preceding night, refined under the growing light and framed by the city's structured rhythm. Tools were aligned, materials prepared, and surfaces perfected, demonstrating not only skill but an understanding of the interplay between human labor and the urban environment. Each motion was a quiet acknowledgement of responsibility, a testament to the discipline and endurance required to navigate both craft and city. The late morning demanded sustained vigilance. Even as the streets outside buzzed with commerce and movement, the workshop remained a locus of control, precision, and reflection. Every surface, every edge, every piece was examined, corrected, and organized, bridging the efforts of night and the demands of day. Florence's silent standards, its history, and its unyielding rhythm continued to shape labor and thought alike. The craftsman, fully immersed in this balance, worked steadily, carrying the city's expectations within each measured action, ensuring that the day's progress remained unbroken and complete. As late morning gave way to the approach of noon, Florence settled into a rhythm of deliberate movement. Sunlight poured into the streets, illuminating stone facades and casting sharp, moving shadows across the city. Merchants continued arranging goods, assistants hurried along cobblestones, and the faint clatter of distant workshops blended with the low hum of conversation. The river's surface reflected the sunlight in small, flickering patterns, adding a dynamic brightness to the cityscape. Even in its busiest hours, Florence maintained order. Each footstep, each cart's movement, each voice followed a rhythm set by centuries of habit, law, and guild oversight. Within this living structure, the craftsman continued his labor, attuned to both the quiet interior of the workshop and the bustling life beyond its walls. The workshop, illuminated by bright, steady light, revealed every detail with precision. Surfaces polished the night before now gleamed, but new imperfections were revealed by the intensity of the sun. The craftsman's hands moved deliberately, smoothing, aligning, and refining each piece of work. Fatigue from the long night and early morning tugged insistently at shoulders and wrists, yet his motions remained careful, guided by both habit and rigorous observation. Each correction, no matter how small, reflected attention to quality and respect for the silent standards of the city. Florence observed not by words but through the persistence of structure, expectation, and consequence, and the craftsman responded accordingly. Tools were arranged with exacting care, materials were sorted and aligned, and the bench became a model of organized effort. Each movement was efficient, precise, and deliberate, a product of both skill and the endurance cultivated over countless hours of practice. The craftsman moved with quiet awareness, adjusting his position, posture, and gestures to maximize precision while minimizing strain. In these late morning hours, the workshop functioned as both sanctuary and crucible, a space where careful labor intersected with the city's unspoken judgment, and where human diligence became tangible through each polished surface and aligned edge. Outside, Florence's activity intensified with the approach of noon. Apprentices carried supplies to workshops, vendors rearranged merchandise to catch the sunlight's best angle, and travelers navigated the streets with deliberate care. Voices rose in measured cadence, punctuated occasionally by laughter or a bell toll. Even animals participated in the urban rhythm, the soft stamping of horse hooves, the occasional neigh, and the rustle of birds among rooftops created a subtle soundscape that framed human activity. The craftsman absorbed these cues, allowing the energy of the city to guide his own timing and movements while maintaining the disciplined focus required within the workshop. Light shifted across surfaces as the sun moved higher, revealing textures, edges, and imperfections previously unseen. The craftsman adjusted workpieces, realigned tools, and refined surfaces with meticulous care. Every gesture was informed by the previous hour's labor, the long night, the awakening of dawn, and the measured activity of the late morning. Precision was paramount. Any lapse could compromise both the integrity of the work and the city's implicit expectations. Florence, as ever, was patient but unforgiving, shaping the craftsman's labor through observation, consequence, and structure. By the edge of noon, the workshop had achieved a quiet perfection. Tools were aligned, surfaces polished, and workpieces carefully positioned for the next stage of creation or inspection. The craftsman's hands moved with steady, practiced motions, balancing fatigue with skill, endurance with careful observation. Each action reflected the intertwined demands of human effort and the silent oversight of the city. The late morning had tested vigilance and precision, and the craftsman met these tests fully, preparing both the space and his own body for the inevitable intensity that noon would bring. The city's pulse was unmistakable, activity and energy rising steadily as the sun climbed. Yet within the workshop, order persisted. The craftsman's labor, precise and deliberate, created a calm counterpoint to the bustle outside. Every surface, edge, and tool reflected diligence, patience, and endurance. Florence, alive with movement and observation, continued to shape labor in ways both subtle and exacting. The approach of noon was not a conclusion but another stage, demanding sustained focus, awareness, and mastery of both craft and environment. By the stroke of noon, Florence had fully awakened into a city alive with both energy and expectation. Sunlight poured over rooftops, glinting on the Arno, and spilling into every alley and piazza. The streets pulsed with purposeful movement, merchants shouted softly to assistants, carts rolled along cobblestones with measured clatter, and townspeople navigated carefully through the flow of traffic. The city's rhythm was precise, an invisible choreography shaped by centuries of tradition, guild enforcement, and social order. Within this vibrant environment, the craftsman continued his work, aware that the intensity of the day demanded both vigilance and speed, without sacrificing precision. Inside the workshop, the sun's rays illuminated every surface, revealing imperfections and textures with unflinching clarity. The craftsman's hands moved steadily, smoothing, aligning, and refining pieces with methodical care. Fatigue pressed upon him, but years of endurance had trained his body and mind to maintain focus even in the face of exhaustion. Each motion was deliberate, balancing efficiency with the uncompromising standards imposed by guilds and the silent observation of the city. Florence required exacting attention, and the craftsman delivered it, layer by layer, piece by piece. The workshop had become a controlled microcosm of the city outside. Tools lay in perfect alignment, surfaces gleamed, and materials were meticulously organized. Each adjustment, each correction, was informed by experience and a deep understanding of both material and consequence. The craftsman moved with awareness of light, shadow, and angle, knowing that noon's harsh illumination left no flaw unseen. Precision, endurance, and patience were tested most rigorously in this hour, where mistakes would be instantly apparent, and the city itself seemed to judge each motion silently. Outside, Florence's energy peaked. Streets were filled with commerce and conversation, the soft clatter of hooves and wheels blending with the calls of vendors and the shuffle of hurried feet. Apprentices and laborers moved with urgent purpose, while the distant chime of a bell marked the passage of the hour. The air was thick with scents of fresh bread, heated stone, and oil from nearby workshops, all blending into the complex sensory rhythm of a city in motion. The craftsman absorbed this subtle energy, allowing it to inform timing, movements, and awareness, even while remaining focused on the exacting work before him. The sunlight continued to shift, changing the perception of surfaces and casting fleeting shadows that revealed details previously unnoticed. The craftsman adjusted tools, refined edges, and polished surfaces, maintaining balance between speed and precision. Every action carried consequence, even minor errors could compromise the integrity of a piece, and Florence's implicit standards demanded nothing less than meticulous attention. Fatigue and the sun's glare were acknowledged but not allowed to dictate performance. By midday, the workshop reflected both the day's accumulated labor and the intense focus of the hour. Workpieces were aligned, tools were sharpened, and surfaces polished to perfection. The craftsman's movements, though slower than in the morning, were deliberate and precise, balancing the necessity of speed with the requirement for exactness. Noon was a test of endurance as much as skill, and he met it with quiet determination. The city outside maintained its rhythm, bustling yet controlled, alive yet structured. Within the workshop, the craftsman's labor mirrored this duality, combining meticulous care with steady persistence. Every surface, every tool, every piece of material bore witness to hours of concentrated effort, guided by both experience and Florence's unspoken demands. Noon was not merely a moment in the day, it was a culmination of night, dawn, and morning, a point where skill, endurance, and attention converged to define both craft and craftsman. As the sun climbed higher past its zenith, Florence shifted into the consistent rhythm of early afternoon. Streets remained busy yet predictable, carts rumbled steadily over cobblestones, merchants called to assistance with measured cadence, and townspeople moved deliberately between workshops, shops, and piazzas. The river reflected the sun's bright glare, casting patterns of dancing light along bridges and walls. Despite the apparent chaos, the city maintained an invisible order, one learned through centuries of habit, guild regulations, and unspoken civic expectations. Within this dynamic, the craftsman continued his labor, acutely aware that the afternoon demanded endurance, consistency, and unwavering attention to detail. Inside the workshop, sunlight streamed through high windows, illuminating surfaces with stark clarity. Shadows shortened and deepened simultaneously, revealing fine imperfections and subtle irregularities previously unseen. The craftsman's hands moved with a steady rhythm, adjusting edges, aligning materials, and smoothing surfaces with deliberate care. The fatigue from the night and morning persisted, but muscle memory and discipline guided each movement. Experience allowed him to correct errors almost before they were fully perceived, and Florence's silent scrutiny demanded this constant vigilance. The workbench, organized with meticulous attention, became the center of a controlled universe. Tools were aligned, materials sorted by type and stage of completion, and surfaces polished to perfection. Every movement was measured, conserving energy while maintaining precision. Even minor corrections carried significance. The city and guild standards left no room for complacency. The craftsman's attention to detail reflected not just personal pride, but an understanding of Florence's persistent, unspoken evaluation. Outside, the streets carried a rhythm all their own. Children ran briefly between buildings, their laughter weaving through the measured calls of vendors. Horses and carts navigated the main thoroughfares, maintaining the cadence of commerce. The occasional church bell tolled, marking the passage of hours and influencing the movements of townspeople. Even in the midst of activity, Florence's order was apparent, movement and sound were balanced, deliberate, and predictable. The craftsman, while focused on his work, absorbed this rhythm, using it to regulate the pace of his own motions, ensuring that each action remained deliberate and precise. Sunlight shifted across the workshop floor, revealing textures, highlights, and minute irregularities. The craftsman paused occasionally to adjust materials or reposition tools, ensuring every detail was perfect. Each pause, while brief, allowed for recalibration, both of the work and of his own focus. Corrections were made with careful precision. Speed was less important than the integrity of the work. Florence, ever observant in its own silent way, demanded this balance between attention and endurance, rewarding those who respected the city's expectations. By early afternoon, the workshop had become a testament to diligence and discipline. Surfaces gleamed, edges were aligned, and tools were perfectly positioned for both continued labor and inspection. The craftsman moved with steady precision, balancing fatigue with the careful attention required to maintain the standards of guild and city alike. The workshop mirrored Florence outside, orderly, purposeful, and alive with subtle activity. Each piece, each stroke, each alignment reflected the careful integration of human labor with the rhythms of the urban environment. The city's energy continued to pulse beyond the workshop walls, yet within, order prevailed. The craftsman's labor, precise and deliberate, created a sanctuary of control and reflection, balancing the ongoing demands of the day with the lessons of the night and morning. The afternoon demanded sustained vigilance, and he met it fully, maintaining focus, patience, and the quiet persistence that Florence required. Every movement was both an act of craft and an acknowledgement of the city's unyielding standards, linking human skill with the structure of urban life. The early afternoon sun hung high above Florence, casting long, bright shafts of light through narrow streets and alleys. Stone surfaces radiated warmth, and shadows sharpened against the walls, revealing textures invisible in the softer light of morning. The city's rhythm remained constant yet intensified. Merchants called across stalls, apprentices carried goods between shops, and the clatter of carts and hooves rose above the background hum of conversation. Even the river glimmered sharply, reflecting sunlight that danced across bridges and walls. Florence moved with a quiet insistence, its energy contained and precise, shaping every step, every sound, every breath of those who labored within it. Inside his workshop, the craftsman felt the warmth seeping through the walls, pressing gently against the cool of shaded floors. The sun illuminated every surface of the workbench, revealing minor imperfections that had been invisible even in the morning light. His hands moved methodically, adjusting materials, refining edges, and smoothing surfaces with deliberate care. Fatigue tugged at his shoulders and wrists, yet skill and muscle memory guided his motions, balancing endurance with precision. Each gesture was both corrective and preventive, reinforcing the integrity of the work and the discipline of the craftsman. Tools lay arranged with meticulous order, surfaces polished to capture the sun's reflection, and materials organized by stage and type. The bench had become a model of controlled labor, a microcosm of the city outside. Each movement reinforced the balance between energy and control, between speed and accuracy, required to meet Florence's silent standards. Even minor corrections carried weight. The intensity of the afternoon sun revealed flaws with merciless clarity, rewarding careful attention and punishing oversight. Outside, the city hummed with life. Carts rattled over cobblestones, vendors shouted softly to assistants, and townspeople moved through streets with steady, deliberate purpose. The occasional church bell tolled in the distance, marking the passage of hours and guiding the tempo of urban activity. Birds stirred among rooftops, and the occasional dog padded along alleyways, contributing to a soundscape both chaotic and controlled. The craftsman absorbed these cues without distraction, allowing the city's rhythm to inform the pacing of his work while maintaining the precision and focus required within the workshop. Sunlight continued to shift, highlighting subtle textures, emphasizing edges, and revealing the minute inconsistencies that demanded correction. The craftsman adjusted tools, repositioned materials, and smoothed surfaces with patient deliberation. Each action was informed by experience, observation, and the unspoken expectation of Florence, where even the smallest flaw was visible under the scrutiny of daylight. The sun's intensity tested endurance, requiring careful management of both energy and attention. By early afternoon, the workshop had achieved a delicate equilibrium. Surfaces gleamed under the sunlight, edges were perfectly aligned, and tools remained meticulously organized. The craftsman's hands, though bearing the fatigue of hours, moved with steady precision. His labor balanced the enduring demands of human skill with the constant, quiet expectations of the city. Florence outside continued its structured chaos, yet within the workshop, order prevailed. Each piece of work reflected the cumulative labor of night, dawn, and morning, now reinforced under the unforgiving clarity of early afternoon light. Even as the city's energy swelled, the workshop remained a sanctuary of controlled labor, reflection, and precision. The craftsman's movements, deliberate and unhurried, maintained the balance between human endurance and the silent judgment of Florence. Every alignment, every smoothing, every adjustment was an acknowledgement of the city's unspoken demands, a testament to diligence, discipline, and the continuous pursuit of perfection within the craft. As early afternoon progressed, a subtle lull settled over Florence. The intensity of morning commerce softened into a more measured rhythm. Streets were still active, but movements became deliberate rather than urgent. Merchants adjusted stalls with careful hands, apprentices carried supplies in controlled steps, and carts continued along cobblestones with a steady, predictable cadence. The river mirrored the bright sky, its rippling surface creating a tranquil counterpoint to the structured bustle. Even amid activity, the city seemed to breathe in a slower, more purposeful rhythm, a pause that allowed both labor and observation to coexist. Inside the workshop, the craftsman maintained a careful focus, aware that even this lull demanded vigilance. Sunlight poured steadily through windows, illuminating every detail of the workbench and highlighting textures and subtle imperfections. Fatigue pressed against his shoulders and wrists, a lingering reminder of the long night and busy morning, yet his movements remained deliberate and precise. Each adjustment, every smoothing of an edge or alignment of a piece, reflected not just skill but endurance, an integration of attention, experience, and the unspoken expectation of Florence itself. The workbench reflected order and control. Tools lay meticulously arranged, surfaces gleamed under the sunlight, and materials were organized by type and stage of completion. The craftsman moved between stations with efficiency, conserving energy while maintaining exacting precision. Corrections were made as needed, informed by both instinct and observation, ensuring that no minor flaw went unaddressed. The city's silent standards were ever present, guiding each motion and decision without overt interference. Outside, the city's rhythm continued to influence the workshop. The shuffle of feet, the soft clatter of hooves, and distant voices created a subtle soundtrack for focused labor. Birds stirred in rooftops, while occasional wagons carried goods along familiar routes. Florence's energy, while moderated from the morning's intensity, remained structured and deliberate, a constant presence shaping behavior and movement. The craftsman absorbed these cues unconsciously, allowing the external order to reinforce the internal discipline of his work. The sunlight shifted gradually, creating nuanced changes in illumination across the workshop. Surfaces revealed new highlights, edges became sharper, and previously unnoticed irregularities demanded attention. The craftsman adjusted tools and materials accordingly, moving with care to preserve alignment, smooth surfaces, and ensure readiness for inspection or use. Fatigue was acknowledged but carefully managed, integrated into the rhythm of labor rather than allowed to dictate it. Each motion was a balance of endurance, skill, and awareness of the city's implicit scrutiny. By this stage of the early afternoon, the workshop had become a controlled microcosm of Florence itself, orderly, deliberate, and alive with subtle movement. The craftsman's hands moved with precision and patience, each action reflecting the lessons of night, dawn, and morning, now reinforced by the steady clarity of daylight. Every tool, material, and surface carried evidence of disciplined effort, a testament to the integration of human skill with the persistent standards of the city. Even as the lull offered a temporary ease in external activity, the demands of craft and vigilance persisted. The craftsman continued his work with measured attention, ensuring that the integrity of each piece, the alignment of every tool, and the clarity of every surface met the unspoken expectations of Florence. The city's subtle rhythm shaped labor, guiding motion, pace, and endurance. In the quiet of early afternoon, the workshop became both sanctuary and proving ground, balancing human skill, fatigue, and precision within the structured pulse of urban life. By mid-afternoon, the sun hung high over Florence, pouring intense light across rooftops, streets, and river surfaces. Shadows, once long and forgiving, now sharpened sharply against the walls, highlighting every uneven stone, every minor crack in the pavement. The city's energy had stabilized into a steady cadence, carts rolled with precise rhythm, vendors arranged goods carefully to catch the sun, and townspeople moved deliberately, aware of the city's unspoken order. Even in the midst of this activity, Florence maintained an air of controlled rigor, and the craftsman, immersed in his workshop, remained attentive to both his labor and the subtle cues of the bustling city outside. Inside the workshop, the sunlight revealed every surface with uncompromising clarity. Surfaces polished in the morning gleamed, but new irregularities were exposed under the harsher light. The craftsman's hands moved with meticulous care, aligning materials, smoothing edges, and checking the stability of workpieces. Fatigue pressed persistently against his body, yet his movements were guided by habit and practiced endurance. Every correction, no matter how minor, carried weight. The city's quiet standards and guild expectations demanded that no imperfection survive unnoticed. The workbench was a display of disciplined order. Tools lay precisely aligned, materials organized by stage of completion, and surfaces prepared to catch the light in ways that revealed both artistry and precision. The craftsman moved deliberately between areas, recalibrating angles, checking measurements, and smoothing surfaces with patient, focused attention. Each motion conserved energy while maintaining accuracy, reflecting both his training and the silent oversight of Florence itself. Outside, Florence pulsed with coordinated energy. Merchants and assistants negotiated arrangements for goods, carts rumbled with measured cadence, and voices carried clearly through the streets without descending into chaos. Even the distant church bell contributed to the city's rhythm, marking the passage of time and influencing the pace of movement. The craftsman internalized these cues, allowing the external structure of Florence to guide his own tempo, ensuring that labor remained precise and measured despite the persistent heat of mid-afternoon. Sunlight shifted across the workshop, emphasizing textures, highlighting edges, and exposing small inconsistencies that required correction. The craftsman's hands adjusted tools, refined surfaces, and realigned materials, each action executed with care to maintain the integrity of the work. The intensity of the light demanded heightened focus, even minor errors became immediately visible, testing endurance, attention, and skill simultaneously. Florence's scrutiny was silent but exacting, shaping labor through expectation rather than words, rewarding diligence and precision while punishing oversight. By mid-afternoon, the workshop had achieved a state of controlled perfection. Surfaces reflected sunlight, tools remained precisely aligned, and materials were arranged meticulously. The craftsman's hands moved steadily, balancing the physical demands of fatigue with the mental discipline of precise attention. The city outside continued its structured rhythm, yet inside, order reigned. Every piece of work bore evidence of sustained focus and careful observation, linking human effort with Florence's persistent, unspoken standards. Even as the intensity of the day pressed onward, the craftsman persisted. The workshop became both a sanctuary and a proving ground, balancing labor, observation, and endurance within the bright clarity of mid-afternoon. Every motion, every adjustment, every alignment was an acknowledgement of the city's silent expectations and a reflection of the continuous integration of skill, patience, and awareness. Florence shaped both the space and the worker, maintaining an invisible discipline that guided each hand, each eye, and each deliberate gesture toward perfection. As mid-afternoon stretched onward, Florence maintained a steady, controlled energy. The streets shimmered under the bright sun, revealing textures in stone and brick that had remained hidden in earlier light. Merchants adjusted their displays with precise, practiced gestures, apprentices moved purposefully, carrying materials or running errands, carts continued their slow, deliberate rumble across the cobblestones. Even the river mirrored this discipline, its surface sparkling yet ordered, reflecting the rhythm of the city itself. The craftsman, fully immersed in the workshop, absorbed this atmosphere, letting the steady pulse of Florence shape the tempo of his labor without allowing distraction to intrude. Sunlight poured through the workshop windows, illuminating every detail of the workbench and materials. Surfaces shone under the bright clarity, revealing both the successes and imperfections of labor performed earlier in the day. The craftsman's hands moved methodically, refining edges, smoothing surfaces, and checking alignments. Each motion was deliberate, balancing care with endurance, ensuring that fatigue would not compromise precision. Even minor adjustments were approached with patience and focus, for in Florence, every detail mattered and the city's silent scrutiny was absolute. The workbench itself reflected the craftsman's dedication. Tools were aligned meticulously, each in its proper place, while materials were organized according to type and stage of preparation. Surfaces gleamed under the sunlight, and workpieces were positioned to reveal every imperfection and correction clearly. The craftsman moved between stations with a fluid rhythm, alternating moments of intense focus with brief pauses to recalibrate and assess progress. Each action conserved energy while maintaining accuracy, reflecting a balance of skill, discipline, and awareness honed over years of experience. Outside, Florence continued its measured activity. Voices rose and fell in a harmonious pattern, blending with the steady movement of carts and the shuffle of feet on stone. Horses stamped and whinnied gently in courtyards, and birds stirred among the rooftops, adding subtle layers to the city's soundscape. The craftsman used these cues unconsciously, timing movements and adjusting rhythm in alignment with the city's persistent order. Florence, though seemingly chaotic to the untrained observer, revealed its structure through repetition, expectation, and the interplay of human and environmental cues. Light shifted gradually as the sun progressed across the sky, highlighting textures, edges, and subtle flaws. The craftsman adjusted tools, realigned materials, and smoothed surfaces with careful attention. Each gesture was a response to both the physical demands of work and the imperceptible judgment of the city, emphasizing precision over speed and endurance over haste. The heat of the sun, the lingering fatigue of earlier hours, and the persistent presence of Florence itself combined to challenge attention and skill, yet the craftsman met these demands with quiet determination. By mid-afternoon, the workshop had become a sanctuary of concentrated labor. Surfaces gleamed, edges were perfectly aligned, and tools were arranged with deliberate care. Every motion reflected not only skill and experience but the integration of human effort with the city's structured rhythm. Even as the sun climbed and the city thrived outside, the workshop remained a controlled environment where discipline, precision, and vigilance reigned. The craftsman's labor mirrored Florence, steady, deliberate, and exacting, each action an acknowledgement of the unspoken standards that governed both craft and city. As mid-afternoon began to wane, the light in Florence softened slightly, losing the harsh brilliance that had dominated earlier hours. Shadows lengthened, stretching across streets, alleys, and rooftops, revealing the contours of buildings and the unevenness of stone in sharper relief. The city's energy persisted but shifted from intensity to a more measured rhythm. Carts continued their steady passage, merchants tended their stalls with careful movements, and townspeople navigated streets with deliberate steps. Even the river mirrored this change, its sparkling surface gradually calming under the shifting angle of sunlight. Florence, alive yet tempered, seemed to signal that the day's work was approaching its critical turning point. Inside the workshop, the craftsman felt the subtle shift in light and energy. Surfaces previously illuminated in stark detail now caught the sun at a gentler angle, casting long, precise shadows across tools and workpieces. His hands moved with practiced care, smoothing, aligning, and inspecting each piece with unwavering focus. Fatigue, accumulated overnight, dawn, and the long morning, pressed insistently on his body, but training and endurance guided every motion. Even as the day began to show signs of wear, attention to detail could not waver. Florence's unspoken standards demanded precision, patience, and persistent observation. The workbench remained a model of discipline. Tools lay aligned, materials sorted and organized, and surfaces polished to reveal both the successes and areas needing refinement. Each movement reflected a balance of endurance and skill, conserving energy while maintaining exactness. Corrections were approached with deliberate care, ensuring that the integrity of each workpiece remained intact. The city's silent scrutiny extended even into this late hour of the afternoon, shaping labor through observation and expectation rather than explicit command. Outside, Florence continued its structured rhythm. Voices rose and fell, harmonizing with the shuffle of feet, the clatter of carts, and the occasional stamping of horse hooves. Children ran briefly through alleyways, their laughter softened by the distance. The craftsman absorbed these cues instinctively, allowing the city's energy to inform the pacing of his own work while maintaining the precision demanded by the bench. Florence was simultaneously dynamic and controlled, a constant guide to the rhythm of labor. Sunlight shifted across the workshop, emphasizing subtle textures and revealing minute imperfections. The craftsman moved methodically, realigning materials, polishing edges, and adjusting tools with patient attention. Every gesture was informed by experience and the city's implicit expectations. Fatigue tested both body and mind, yet the craftsman persisted, balancing careful observation with sustained endurance. The shift of light reminded him that time passed inexorably, and every hour carried significance for the integrity of his craft. By the late afternoon, the workshop reflected the culmination of night, dawn, and morning's labor. Surfaces gleamed under softened sunlight, edges remained precise, and tools were perfectly positioned for continued work. The craftsman's hands moved with steady, deliberate motions, balancing accumulated fatigue with vigilance and discipline. Florence outside continued its structured activity, yet within the workshop, order, precision, and focus reigned. The city's silent expectations had guided labor for hours, and the craftsman's persistence ensured that each detail met the standards demanded by both craft and environment. Even as the sun began its slow descent, the workshop remained a sanctuary of controlled effort. The craftsman's actions mirrored the city's rhythm, balancing endurance, awareness, and precision. Each alignment, each smoothing, each careful adjustment acknowledged Florence's unspoken standards, linking human skill with the structure and life of the city. The slow decline of afternoon was not a signal to rest but an invitation to maintain focus, vigilance, and measured action, preparing both worker and craft for the approaching evening. Late afternoon brought long shadows stretching across Florence, softening the harsh brilliance of the day and transforming familiar streets and piazzas into a patchwork of light and shade. The city's energy shifted subtly, merchants adjusted displays with careful precision, apprentices moved steadily along narrow alleys, and the clatter of carts softened as pace slowed. Even the river reflected the sun's gentle angle, shimmering faintly while its currents moved with quiet determination. Florence, vibrant yet measured, communicated an unspoken expectation: the day's labors were approaching their conclusion, and diligence must persist even as light waned. Within the workshop, the craftsman noticed the change immediately. Sunlight now entered at a shallow angle, illuminating surfaces with a warm, golden hue that highlighted textures and revealed subtle irregularities previously unnoticed. His hands moved with unwavering focus, smoothing, adjusting, and aligning each workpiece. Fatigue weighed heavily, pressing against wrists, shoulders, and back, yet experience guided each motion. Every gesture reflected both skill and discipline, tempered by awareness that the city's implicit scrutiny never ceased. Florence demanded vigilance, patience, and endurance, and the craftsman met these demands quietly but consistently. The workbench was a reflection of meticulous care. Tools were perfectly aligned, surfaces polished, and materials arranged according to stage and purpose. The craftsman moved between sections deliberately, checking angles, refining edges, and ensuring each piece was flawless. Even small corrections were given careful attention, for the waning sunlight revealed flaws that required immediate remedy. Each movement balanced energy conservation with precision, reflecting the combination of physical skill and mental focus necessary to meet both the demands of the craft and the silent standards of Florence. Outside, the city exhibited a controlled rhythm. Voices carried softly over stone streets, harmonizing with the measured footsteps of townspeople and the occasional clatter of carts. Apprentices completed errands, vendors ensured that goods were properly arranged, and distant church bells chimed the passing hours. Birds shifted restlessly among rooftops, while the river reflected the golden light in flickering patterns. The craftsman internalized these cues without distraction, letting Florence's steady energy guide the tempo of his work while maintaining unwavering attention to detail. Sunlight continued to evolve, casting long, deliberate shadows across the workshop floor. Surfaces revealed minor imperfections and details that required refinement. The craftsman adjusted tools, realigned workpieces, and polished edges with patient diligence. Each gesture was informed by both the physical demands of fatigue and the unspoken judgment of the city, emphasizing careful observation and disciplined execution. Florence, though silent, shaped labor through expectation and presence, rewarding precision and punishing oversight even without direct comment. By late afternoon, the workshop had become a controlled environment of order and focus. Surfaces glimmered under the golden sunlight, edges were aligned perfectly, and tools rested in their precise positions. The craftsman's movements, deliberate and steady, balanced weariness with exacting attention. The city outside continued its structured pulse, yet within, the workshop remained a sanctuary of careful labor, reflection, and discipline. Each adjustment, alignment, and smoothing carried the cumulative weight of hours spent in preparation, responding to Florence's silent standards and unyielding expectations. Even as long shadows crept across streets and rooftops, the craftsman's focus did not waver. The workshop reflected both the intensity of labor and the enduring demands of the city, linking human skill, patience, and vigilance with the persistent rhythm of Florence. The late afternoon was a period of reflection and consolidation, a final stage to ensure that every piece, surface, and tool met the exacting standards required before the approaching evening. As the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, Florence was bathed in warm amber light. Shadows stretched across rooftops, streets, and piazzas, softening the harsh lines of buildings and lending a golden glow to the city. The pace of activity shifted subtly, carts moved more slowly, merchants spoke in quieter tones, and townspeople navigated streets with deliberate calm. Even the river seemed to absorb the day's intensity, its surface shimmering gently under the low sun. Florence exuded both serenity and expectation, signaling that the day's work was nearing its culmination, and that diligence must remain even as the afternoon waned. Inside the workshop, the craftsman adjusted to the changing light. The angled sunlight illuminated surfaces with warm tones, emphasizing textures and revealing subtle inconsistencies that had escaped notice earlier. His hands continued to move with careful precision, smoothing edges, aligning materials, and inspecting surfaces with patient scrutiny. Fatigue was undeniable, a persistent weight in muscles and joints, but years of discipline allowed endurance to guide each movement. The unspoken oversight of Florence continued to shape his labor, demanding careful attention to every detail, every alignment, every joint. The workbench remained a model of exacting order. Tools rested in perfect alignment, materials were organized by type and stage of completion, and surfaces glimmered under the amber light. The craftsman moved between areas with practiced efficiency, performing small corrections, adjusting angles, and polishing surfaces. Each gesture was deliberate, conserving energy while maintaining precision. Even minor adjustments held significance. The city's subtle scrutiny and the guild's expectations ensured that nothing was overlooked. Outside, Florence's rhythm had softened, but the city was far from still. Voices carried gently across cobblestones, blending with the measured shuffle of feet and the occasional creak of a cart. Children's laughter echoed briefly from alleyways, while birds flitted among rooftops. The craftsman absorbed these cues, using the city's steady, measured energy to inform the pace of his work, maintaining alignment with Florence's unspoken order while attending to the minutiae of craft within the workshop. Sunlight shifted again, casting long, deliberate shadows across benches, floors, and workpieces. Each surface was revealed in subtle detail, minor imperfections, hidden flaws, and edges requiring adjustment were brought into sharp relief. The craftsman responded with care, realigning materials, refining surfaces, and ensuring tools were positioned precisely. Every movement balanced skill with endurance, reinforcing the connection between human labor and the persistent expectations of Florence. By the approach of evening, the workshop reflected both the accumulated labor of the day and the disciplined focus required to maintain excellence. Surfaces gleamed, edges were aligned, and tools rested in exact positions. The craftsman's hands moved steadily, each action deliberate, conserving strength while maintaining precision. Florence outside continued its measured pulse, but within the workshop, control and order prevailed. The city's silent standards had guided labor through hours of sunlight, and now the craftsman prepared for the final stage of the day, ensuring that every detail met both practical and aesthetic standards before nightfall. The approaching evening carried with it a sense of transition, a time to consolidate, review, and perfect. The workshop became a sanctuary where human skill, patience, and attention were harmonized with the city's persistent rhythm. Each gesture, each adjustment, each careful alignment acknowledged the enduring presence of Florence's silent judgment, linking the craftsman's labor to the broader life of the city as daylight began its gradual retreat. As evening approached, Florence was bathed in a warm, golden light that softened the city's contours and cast long, stretching shadows across rooftops, streets, and plazas. The day's intensity had calmed into a measured rhythm, carts moved with deliberate slowness, vendors adjusted merchandise carefully in the waning sun, and townspeople moved through the streets with calm purpose. The river reflected the amber sky, its surface glimmering with the final brilliance of daylight. Florence, alive yet tempered, communicated that the day's labor was drawing to a close, yet it demanded that diligence persist until the final moments of sunlight. Inside the workshop, the craftsman worked under the soft glow of the late afternoon sun filtering through tall windows. Surfaces and edges glimmered with warmth, revealing details and minor imperfections that required careful correction. His hands moved with precise, deliberate rhythm, smoothing surfaces, aligning materials, and adjusting tools. Fatigue pressed against shoulders, wrists, and back, but years of experience and endurance guided every motion. Each gesture reflected both skill and attention, ensuring that the work maintained its integrity under Florence's silent scrutiny. The workbench was a testament to discipline and care. Tools lay in exact alignment, materials were meticulously organized, and surfaces reflected both light and effort. The craftsman moved between areas efficiently, performing small corrections, refining edges, and polishing surfaces. Even minor adjustments carried significance. The city's expectations, though unspoken, shaped every action, demanding vigilance and precision. Each motion balanced conservation of energy with exacting standards, a reflection of both the craftsman's endurance and the city's quiet judgment. Outside, Florence's rhythm was gentler but persistent. Voices rose softly, blending with the measured shuffle of feet and the occasional clatter of carts. Birds flitted among rooftops, while children ran briefly through alleyways before retreating to homes. The church bell tolled intermittently, marking the passing hours and reinforcing the city's structured cadence. The craftsman absorbed these cues instinctively, allowing the external rhythm to inform his pace while maintaining careful attention to every workpiece in the workshop. The sunlight shifted continuously, creating fleeting highlights and shadows that emphasized textures, edges, and imperfections. The craftsman responded with careful precision, realigning workpieces, polishing surfaces, and adjusting tools to maintain clarity and accuracy. Each gesture was a balance of endurance, skill, and focus, informed by Florence's silent expectations and the long hours of labor already endured. Even as the day's light waned, vigilance could not lapse, perfection demanded attention until the final moments of visibility. By the golden hours of evening, the workshop had become a sanctuary of measured labor. Surfaces gleamed, edges were precise, and tools rested in deliberate order. The craftsman's motions, deliberate and steady, balanced fatigue with exacting attention. Florence outside continued its structured life, yet within the workshop, precision, order, and patience reigned. Each correction, alignment, and adjustment reflected the culmination of the day's labor, linking skill and endurance to the city's unspoken standards. Even as sunlight faded, the workshop remained a place of disciplined activity. The craftsman's hands moved with quiet deliberation, every motion an acknowledgement of Florence's persistent rhythm and the cumulative effort of night, dawn, and day. The golden hours of evening were both a conclusion and a preparation, a time to perfect, consolidate, and honor the craft before the approaching darkness. The city's subtle influence shaped every action, ensuring that labor remained consistent, precise, and in harmony with the life surrounding it. As the sun dipped lower, Florence was cloaked in deep amber and honeyed light. Shadows stretched long across the streets, bridges, and rooftops, softening the geometry of the city and transforming familiar corners into patterns of shadow and light. The pace of life slowed, carts moved deliberately, their wheels clattering softly along cobblestones, merchants tended to the final arrangements of their wares, and townspeople walked with careful steps, aware that the day was drawing toward its close. Even the river reflected the fading light, its surface glittering with warm hues before darkening in quiet acknowledgement of approaching night. The city seemed to pause, holding its energy in measured suspense as it prepared for the transition to evening. Inside the workshop, the craftsman worked with an acute awareness of the fading light. The slanting sun cast long, sharp shadows across benches, tools, and workpieces, revealing every subtle imperfection that had previously escaped notice. His hands moved with deliberate care, aligning materials, refining edges, and polishing surfaces. Fatigue pressed insistently on wrists, shoulders, and back, but experience and discipline guided each gesture. There was no rush, only the steady application of skill and attention to maintain the integrity of the work under the city's silent, exacting scrutiny. The workbench remained a model of precision and order. Tools were aligned, surfaces polished, and materials meticulously arranged according to type and stage of completion. The craftsman moved between stations with methodical efficiency, attending to small corrections and refinements as needed. Every adjustment, however minor, reflected the persistent influence of Florence's unspoken standards. Even as light softened and the day waned, vigilance remained essential, perfection could not be compromised, and every detail demanded attention. Outside, Florence's rhythm had slowed, yet it persisted. Voices softened and blended with the faint shuffle of feet and the distant clatter of carts returning home. Birds called quietly from rooftops as the shadows lengthened, and the occasional church bell tolled the hours, echoing through streets now quieting with dusk. The craftsman absorbed these cues unconsciously, letting the city's tempo shape his own, synchronizing the pace of labor with the muted rhythm of urban life. The slanting sunlight revealed textures and details that required careful attention. The craftsman paused occasionally to adjust materials, align edges, and polish surfaces, ensuring that every piece met exacting standards. Each gesture balanced skill with endurance, reflecting the culmination of long hours of work and the city's unspoken expectation of diligence. Fatigue was acknowledged but managed, attention could not waver, for Florence demanded that craft be perfected in every stage of the day. By late evening, the workshop had become a sanctuary of quiet labor. Surfaces glimmered in fading light, edges remained precise, and tools were arranged in meticulous order. The craftsman moved with careful deliberation, conserving energy while maintaining the accuracy demanded by both guild standards and the city's silent oversight. The long shadows of evening transformed the workshop into a space where skill, patience, and focus coexisted in balance, reflecting the city's rhythm and the culmination of a full day's labor. Even as Florence transitioned toward night, the workshop remained alive with precise motion. Every alignment, smoothing, and adjustment was a testament to the craftsman's endurance and discipline. The fading light, the long shadows, and the quiet pulse of the city all reinforced the persistence required to maintain excellence. In this hour, labor became a quiet dialogue between human skill and the enduring, invisible standards of the city, a balance of observation, patience, and continued diligence before darkness fully claimed the streets. As evening deepened, Florence shifted into a subdued, contemplative state. The sun, now low on the horizon, cast a warm amber glow across rooftops and streets, painting the city in hues of gold and burnt sienna. Shadows stretched long and lean, transforming familiar alleys and piazzas into a tapestry of light and dark. The energy of the day had softened, carts rolled slowly over cobblestones, merchants finalized arrangements of their wares, and townspeople moved with calm deliberation toward homes and gathering places. Even the river reflected the gentle retreat of sunlight, its rippling surface absorbing the last warmth of the day. Florence, though quieter now, maintained its expectation. Labor persisted until every task was completed, every detail attended to, every surface perfected. Inside the workshop, the craftsman continued his labor with unwavering attention. The slanting light highlighted textures, edges, and minute imperfections that demanded careful correction. His hands moved methodically, adjusting alignments, smoothing surfaces, and polishing materials to catch the last rays of sun. Fatigue pressed insistently against muscles and joints, yet skill and discipline guided each gesture. Each motion reflected the combined lessons of night, dawn, morning, and afternoon, integrating endurance, observation, and precision. The city's unspoken judgment remained ever present, shaping labor without words, rewarding diligence and exactness. The workbench, bathed in fading light, displayed meticulous order. Tools rested in perfect alignment, materials were organized by stage and type, and surfaces reflected the cumulative effort of the day. The craftsman moved deliberately between stations, performing minor corrections, checking alignments, and refining edges. Even the smallest adjustment carried significance, for in Florence, each detail mattered, and the golden evening light revealed what the sun's height had obscured. The balance of energy conservation and precision remained crucial, ensuring that no part of the work suffered neglect. Outside, the city embraced a quieter rhythm. Voices softened, footsteps were measured, and carts moved with gentle cadence. Birds returned to rooftops, and the occasional church bell tolled in the distance, marking the passage of hours. The craftsman absorbed these cues unconsciously, integrating the steady pulse of Florence into the pace of his work. The city's structured life guided labor without distraction, reinforcing discipline, patience, and consistency. Sunlight gradually waned, casting surfaces in a final, warm glow. The craftsman paused periodically, adjusting tools, realigning materials, and inspecting surfaces with careful scrutiny. Fatigue tugged insistently at his attention, yet he continued to work with deliberate focus, ensuring that every piece met the exacting standards demanded by both guild and city. Each movement was a careful negotiation between human endurance, precision, and the persistent expectations of Florence. By the final hours of daylight, the workshop was a space of quiet mastery. Surfaces gleamed subtly, edges were exact, and tools remained perfectly aligned. The craftsman's hands moved with measured, deliberate precision, balancing weariness with careful observation. The fading sunlight, long shadows, and the city's quiet oversight reinforced the discipline required to complete a full day's labor. Each adjustment, smoothing, and alignment was a reflection of enduring skill and the subtle influence of Florence, merging human diligence with the structured life of the city. Even as the last light of day faded, the workshop retained its ordered rhythm. The craftsman's labor, though heavy with fatigue, remained precise and deliberate. Every motion reflected the integration of practice, endurance, and awareness, ensuring that the day's work concluded with integrity. Florence's unspoken expectations persisted until the final moments of sunlight, linking craft, skill, and observation in a quiet dialogue of diligence and completion. As the sun finally sank beneath the horizon, Florence was transformed into a landscape of shadow and muted light. The streets, once vibrant with movement, now carried only the quiet echo of footsteps and the occasional clatter of a returning cart. The river, reflecting the darkening sky, flowed gently under bridges as its surface shifted from gold to deep, reflective blue. Florence seemed to exhale after the day's relentless rhythm, settling into a controlled calm that embraced the city with both serenity and expectation. Even as darkness spread, the city's subtle oversight remained. Precision, discipline, and diligence were expected until the day's labor was fully concluded. Inside the workshop, the craftsman continued to work under the fading light. The warm glow of dusk filtered through windows, illuminating surfaces with gentle clarity. Every edge, every surface, every tool remained under scrutiny, though the intensity of daylight had softened. Fatigue pressed heavily on shoulders, wrists, and back, yet years of experience and perseverance allowed labor to continue. Hands moved with practiced precision, aligning, smoothing, and adjusting, ensuring that no imperfection went uncorrected. Each gesture was both an act of skill and an acknowledgement of Florence's persistent, silent judgment. The workbench reflected a day's worth of labor and careful attention. Tools rested in exact alignment, materials were neatly organized, and surfaces captured the last traces of sunlight. The craftsman moved with deliberate care, performing final inspections, correcting subtle flaws, and ensuring that each piece met the exacting standards of craft and city alike. Even as darkness deepened, vigilance did not waver, precision was demanded to the very end, and the craft could not be left incomplete. Outside, Florence settled into the quiet cadence of early night. Voices softened to murmurs, footsteps were slow and measured, and animals moved through alleyways with cautious steps. Church bells tolled softly, marking the passage of hours and guiding the city's fading rhythm. The craftsman absorbed these subtle cues unconsciously, letting the calm and structure of the city reinforce focus and methodical labor within the workshop. Florence's presence, though now muted, continued to guide action and attention. As night deepened, shadows lengthened across benches and floors. The craftsman paused occasionally, inspecting surfaces one last time, adjusting tools, and realigning workpieces to ensure perfect organization. Fatigue was ever present, a tangible weight pressing on body and mind, yet concentration and discipline prevailed. Each final adjustment, smoothing, and alignment was an acknowledgement of the day's labor and of Florence's unspoken standards. Even as darkness claimed the city, the workshop remained a space of careful order and reflection. By the close of day, the workshop stood as a testament to diligence, skill, and enduring attention. Surfaces gleamed subtly under the last remaining light, edges were precise, and tools rested in perfect alignment. The craftsman's hands, though heavy with fatigue, moved with quiet deliberation, ensuring that each piece of work reflected both mastery and dedication. Florence outside, though calm and shadowed, still imposed its persistent expectations, linking the day's labor to the city's silent rhythm and the unyielding standards of guild and tradition. Finally, as darkness fully enveloped the city, the craftsman completed his labor. Every surface, every alignment, every polished edge bore witness to hours of tireless attention. The workshop, a sanctuary of order amid Florence's structured life, reflected the integration of human skill, patience, and discipline with the city's quiet but exacting oversight. The day's work, from the first light of dawn to the final hour of night, had been a continuous dialogue between labor and environment, endurance and precision, craft and the unspoken judgment of Florence. Nightfall did not signal neglect or pause but the completion of a carefully measured cycle. The craftsman, having met every demand of the day, allowed himself a moment of quiet observation, appreciating the harmony of his labor with the rhythm of the city. Florence, steadfast and enduring, would awaken again with dawn, continuing the relentless cycle of observation, expectation, and discipline. But for now, the workshop rested, silent, precise, and perfect, a mirror of the craftsman's enduring dedication and the city's ever-present standards.